Our story begins in the academy with an explosion. Our protagonist, Haruto, was thrown to the ground, and a man teasingly told him that he hadn't realized he was there. The man with green hair then asked if he really just got hit by elementary magic and told him that he was amazing as he struggled to stand up in pain. When he managed to stand, he asked the man if it wasn't enough and told him to return it to him as promised, because he had brought what he asked for. The man raised the bag of food and told everyone that it was the fresh sirloin burger, the famous limited school lunch with only 50 pieces sold per day. He confirmed that he did get enough for all of them, but the green-haired man asked him where the drink was. The man retorted that he should have been more considerate. Then, releasing a fireball in his hand, he threw it at him while shouting that as punishment for not bringing drinks, he should have another serving. This hit him and made him fall to the ground once again. He then stood up again while the men teasingly told him that, as they expected, he was exceptionally weak. Suddenly, a lady furiously asked the men what they were doing. The men noticed that it was Shinjuku, and they all knew that she was part of the discipline committee. The man then threw his cell phone at his face while shouting for him to be grateful it was all he had for today. The cell phone cracked when it hit the ground. Shinjuku rushed to him and called in worry as he was picking up his phone. She asked him if he was okay, but he told her to stop and that she'd be excluded as well if she hung out with him. She sadly told him that it wasn't something she cared about, but he angrily told her that they couldn't survive in that place if they hung out like they did when they were little. Then he walked away, leaving her sadly calling his name. He then walked into the building, and the students whispered that he was the special admission student. They asked how he managed to enter such a prestigious school when he has zero magic capacity. They also whispered that they had heard there was an error in the scoring system and wondered if he had a stand to take the exam for him. Although Haruto doesn't want to admit it, he can't deny the rumors questioning how an underachieving student like himself got into that prestigious school. One day, out of nowhere, his parents suddenly informed him of his admission as a special admission student, and even if he had wanted to ask them why, it was too late. He looked up at the sky and wondered if maybe he should have died along with them that day. Haruto was admitted to the school with zero magic capacity, so he couldn't major in the mage course. Consequently, he was forced to become a swordsman. And in the current society where magic is overwhelmingly dominant, he was considered useless, only able to fight in melee range. Being the only survivor in his family and a constant burden in dungeon raids, they gave him the nickname the God of Plagues after his class. He returned to his apartment building and opened his door, but before he walked inside, he noticed the letter on his door. He sat down holding the letter and noticed that there wasn't a stamp nor a sender's name, but he decided to open it anyway. When he peeled back the sealed sticker, he was surprised as a powerful light emanated from it. The light enveloped him while he was in shock, and eventually the letter dragged him inside. He opened his eyes to find his surroundings were colorful, which made him anxiously ask where he was. The water he stepped on parted, and a shadow emerged. The shadow, smiling, told him that it was the year 2054 according to the Western calendar, and asked if he was indeed the 16-year-old Kujyou Haruto, to which he stutteringly replied yes. The shadow told him that his name was Kujyou Haruto, and that he was him from the future. He explained that he was sending the letter from the future, and that in 10 years he would become a mage able to manipulate space and time. However, waiting that long was too much, so he decided to train him right there, and then to become a grand mage of space and time. Haruto stared at the shadow, wondering what the man was saying. His future self told him he knew he was skeptical, because he was him, but insisted that a picture was worth 1,000 words, and just once he should do as he tells him. His future self then instructed him to enter the F-Rank dungeon Shinjuku Imperial Garden alone, and said he would speak to him again after he had done it. The shadow then disappeared. A moment later, he entered the Shinjuku Imperial Garden, an F-Rank dungeon. He knew that a clear dungeon like this one didn't really have anything worth taking. He then told his future self that if this was some kind of prank, he should know what would happen. His future self replied that he could burn and tear the letter as he liked and instructed him to go straight and turn right at the end. Clenching his teeth in frustration, he followed the directions, and a moment later, he faced a wall. He told his future self that he had reached a dead end and asked if he could burn him now, but his future self simply told him to put the letter into the slit in the wall. He sighed and inserted the letter into the slit. To his shock, the slit lit up, and the wall moved aside, creating enough space for him to walk through. He walked inside, having never heard of something like a hidden route. Suddenly, something bright lit up the dark hidden space, and then he saw a huge crystal tied by a chain. His future self told him that it was a skill cube and asked him if it was the first time he had seen one. His future self then ordered him to touch it and acquire the skill. He walked closer to it with apprehension and touched it, but then his future self apologized to him. Suddenly, the skill cube cracked and turned red, then a purple light appeared around the skill cube, and a hole opened above him. It began to suck in the blocks around him and started to form something in midair. When it finished sucking in the blocks at high speed and forming the object, the smoke slowly disappeared, revealing a huge form in front of him. He was stunned in horror when he saw glowing eyes, and then a golem jumped closer to him. It stared at him with its one bright eye, and he wondered if it really was a golem. But then it attacked him, swiftly hitting him and throwing him away. In pain, with blurry eyes, he wondered what was happening and if he had been scammed. Suffering severe injuries, he felt hot and realized that his entire body was burning. He noticed his consciousness fading and wondered if he was going to die. He then looked at his phone, saw images of his mother, his father, and his little sister Ria, and told them that he could finally be with the rest of them. But then the letter lit up, and his future self asked him if it was okay. It reminded him that he was a failure at the school his parents had enrolled him in, and that he was going to die a pointless death after being scammed by him. It then asked him if he was really okay with that, which jolted him back to consciousness. He remembered his miserable life where nothing good ever happened. However, he realized that it was just his life, and he had convinced himself that this was how it was supposed to be, so he had given up. He replied that there was no way he would be okay with it, and it told him that if that was the case, he should resist, survive resiliently, and change his miserable life. When the golem's attack was about to hit him, he didn't avoid it and was killed, but he still managed to defiantly tell it not to mess with him in a place like this. Suddenly, the system displayed a hidden quest in the Shinjuku Imperial Garden, an F-Rank dungeon, and he had met the requirement for the Mage of Space and Time's indomitable spirit. Therefore, his adventurous death was cancelled, and his physical body would undergo a rollback. He then opened his eyes, confident that he would survive when he met the requirements. When he met the requirements, the skill cube shattered into pieces, releasing a powerful force that headed straight for where he was lying. The powerful force hit him directly, and in the golem's eyes he was standing. His body was surging with strong electrified power. The system then showed that he had acquired space-time magic along with quick body material rewind and stop chain. It also indicated that he had obtained the space-time mage passive skill level 1, potential unleashing with a 30% boost. However, he just looked at his hand and asked, "What the hell is this?" His future self explained that taking a shortcut to his awakening required potentially fatal harsh conditions. His future self then apologized for not informing him beforehand. He revealed that space-time magic would not be discovered for another 10 years because it was part of a hidden quest that, until now, only he had encountered. He asked his future self if he was really from the future, but his future self simply told him that he looked alive now and that the tutorial was about to start. Meanwhile, the golem behind him was ready to squeeze him. When the golem launched an attack, he felt it and immediately looked back, managing to jump away in time to dodge the golem's hand. He then noticed that his body felt so light, making him wonder if it was the effect of the passive skill. His future self told him that he would teach him how a space-time mage is supposed to fight, and that he shouldn't use his eyes to see, but just feel the flow of time that rules the world. He followed the order, and his future self proudly told him that he could absolutely do it because he was him, after all. The golem launched its huge fist at him, but he didn't move and tried to concentrate, feeling the flow of time. When the golem's fist was an inch away, he opened his eyes, stared into the golem's eyes, and jumped away in time to dodge it. He then activated his space-time magic and landed on the golem's hand. Using his quick body, he jumped in front of the golem, ran up the golem's arm, and when he reached the top, he launched his sword at the golem's head while telling the golem that it must be its core. He then plunged his sword into the golem's head and pushed down with all his strength, cracking the core inside its head. Gradually, the golem's head cracked further until it exploded into pieces. He descended to the ground and walked away while the golem's body shattered behind him. After defeating the golem, his level increased by 4, his swordsman's skill by 8, and he obtained 45,800 credits. As he stared at the system, his future self asked him if he believed him now and called him God of Plagues. He gripped his sword tightly and replied that somewhat he did. His future self then told him that for the next necessary step, he should exit the dungeon. He asked his future self if there was still something else left to do, to which his future self replied yes, and that there was just a little leader for him to make. They were going to where Shinjuku would be killed by a monster today. He stopped walking upon hearing this and was shocked when he realized what was said. He then asked his future self to repeat what he had said. His future self explained that he was talking about his childhood friend Shinjuku, who along with some friends would enter the Ikebukuro D-rank dungeon today and be killed by the extra boss monster. He positioned his feet as his future self urged him to go save Shinjuku and change the future. His future self then called him a mage of space and time as he rushed out of the dungeon. While he was rushing, his future self told him that on May 23rd, 2054, in the Western calendar, in the deepest part of the Ikebukuro D-rank dungeon, an unexpected appearance of a C-rank extra boss would result in the death of Shinjuku Rin. Despite her party member casting a rescue spell, there were no other adventurers around, and hence they were completely wiped out. Although Shinjuku wasn't entirely at fault, before his future self could say more, he shouted at him to shut up. A moment later, he arrived in the Ikebukuro D-rank dungeon. Exhausted, he asked his future self why he hadn't said anything earlier, but his future self merely asked him back if he wasn't the one who had wanted to avoid associating with anyone else because anyone he came into contact with would meet with misfortune. He reminded him that this was also the reason why he was rather comfortable being shunned and asked him why he was so angry on another's behalf. Suddenly, he was stopped by a momentary pause as goblins surrounded him, but his future self told him to stop acting as if he had suddenly become enlightened. He grabbed his sword from behind his back, and when the goblins leapt together to attack him, he slashed them swiftly. His future self told him that the world could be changed by his actions, but but he just told his future self to shut up and that he would do whatever he wanted. His future self replied that he understood and that this was the response he was looking for. As a reward, he would teach him an application of space-time magic. Meanwhile, on the deepest floor, a huge explosion could be heard along with screams, and Shinonome was thrown into midair. She slammed onto the ground while her friends watched in horror. They worriedly called her name, but she couldn't stand up because of the pain. When she opened her eyes, she saw the C-rank extra boss, Dark Sentinel, in front of them. A man shouted that they hadn't been informed about it, and a lady who was trying to call for help shouted in panic that it was no use because there was no response to the rescue spell. Another lady urged them to calm down and told them that if they all attacked at once, they had a chance of winning. But the man stutteringly replied that he couldn't do it and that he didn't want to die. Dark Sentinel lit its huge sword while the lady shouted at the man that now was not the time to be saying something like that. But then, Dark Sentinel swung its sword toward them, and it hit all of them, throwing them into midair together. Shinonome managed to sit up and was shocked to see that all her friends were down on the ground. Many had collapsed, but then she saw one of her friends still alive and begging for help. She pushed herself to stand and attack Dark Sentinel with her firepower. She managed to hit it in the head, but it didn't even scratch the Sentinel, leaving her stunned in horror. The Dark Sentinel raised its sword, and as it swung down toward her, she closed her eyes in tears and shouted for someone to help. Fortunately, Haruto appeared just in time and used his stop chain skill to halt the Dark Sentinel's attack. He then asked her if she was all right. She opened her eyes, stunned to see him there, but he simply faced the Dark Sentinel and told her to stay back. He deactivated his stop chain skill, grabbed his sword from behind, and jumped away to dodge the Dark Sentinel's sword. He then jumped behind it, and as it turned around quickly to attack him again, he blocked its attack with his sword and swung at its stomach, knowing that was the spot, but his attack was merely blocked by its armor, making him realize it was too hard. The Dark Sentinel launched another attack, which he blocked with his sword, trying his best to compete with it. Unfortunately, his sword cracked under the force and broke in half. The Dark Sentinel stared at him in anger, making him curse under his breath. It then gathered power from its eyes and pointed it at him, releasing a strong power that caused an explosion. Using his quick body skill in time, he ran away and appeared behind it. Knowing that his sword didn't work on its armor but was effective on parts not covered, he realized he needed to focus on its head. The Dark Sentinel turned around, and he immediately launched his broken sword at its head. His future self reminded him that his sword was broken, but he simply replied that he knew. He then used his material rewind skill, and as his sword began to repair itself, he launched it at the Dark Sentinel's head, which was gathering power again. The tip of his sword struck the Dark Sentinel's eye just in time, piercing through to the helmet. The head then became powerless, and he managed to land safely on the ground. His future self then told him that it seems he had changed fate itself while Shinonome stared at him in shock and confusion. A moment later, Shinonome rushed to him, asking what in the world was going on and shouting at him to explain, but she decided to thank him first for saving her and her friends. He told her not to worry about it and pleadingly asked if she could keep it a secret for now. She thought for a moment and asked if, in other words, that would be a secret just between the two of them. He confusedly replied yes, that it would be like that. She smiled upon hearing it and then asked him what the source of his strength was. Earlier, he was about to reply when his future self told him that he wanted to keep future branching routes to a minimum and abstain from making any careless comments about space-time magic. He stopped upon hearing his future self but asked Shinonome if she could keep what he was about to tell her a secret too. She looked at him in confusion, but he explained that a lot was going on and he didn't want to stand out. His future self then suggested that he should deceive her somehow, which Shinonome overheard and asked if the voice she just heard was him. Shocked, he replied that it was not him at all, and he didn't know what she was talking about. He then glared angrily at the letter and swore to kill his future self later for it. He sighed and told Shinonome that he wanted to try out a special swordsman skill he had been training with forever, but since it was still incomplete, it wasn't something to tell everyone about. She smilingly replied that she understood, and if that was the case, she would keep the secret, making him sigh in relief, knowing that he had somehow managed to deceive her. Just like that, Shinonome's supposedly fated death was averted, and at the same time, Haruto was able to obtain overwhelming magic and power. Haruto knew he couldn't change the past, but he could continue to change what was yet to come. Suddenly, someone called him God of Plagues, and when he looked back, he saw the bullying man at the door calling him and teasingly laughing at him. A moment later, one man told him that he heard he went into the Ikebukuro dungeon yesterday, and a guy he happened to see told him that he just ran home powerless without being able to be of any use. Another man teasingly told them that it seemed they even ran into an extra boss and had to take a training session with it, which made them laugh. The man asked his friends if it was expected of the God of Plagues, but Haruto was just busy wondering who the witness was besides Shinonome. The man then told him that a buddy of his was also there and ended up being carried to the hospital with severe injuries, so the hospitalization expenses would be hefty. The man then gestured for money and asked if he understood what he meant by that. He then demanded that he pay up, and in return, they wouldn't tell anyone about it. The men then asked him what he had to say, but he remained silent, infuriating them and prompting them to demand he say something. The man then conjured a fire in his hand and reminded him that he would become their target for practicing attack spells again. He shouted that he had enough, which made the man stretch his hands in anger and ask him to repeat what he just said. Defiantly, he reiterated that he'd had enough and asked them if they were deaf pieces of trash, which enraged the man and his companions. They launched an attack at him in anger while calling him a bastard, but he was thankful for his increased stats as he could clearly see the scumbag's movements. He then swiftly attacked them one by one. He stopped behind them, and they all looked around in horror, wondering what was going on. He told them to listen well and warned them not to come near him ever again, or else the same thing would happen. He was holding their wallets and a lighter. One of the men shouted that those wallets were theirs, but he simply lit the lighter and told them that it was a promise between them and him. He then seriously asked them what they said, to which they all nodded in fear. After that, they all ran away. He thought they wouldn't mess with him anymore, and decided to go back to his class. A moment later, he was sitting in the class, noticing that their next class was magic capacity measurement. The teacher announced that they would begin that semester's magic capacity measurement immediately and called Haruto's name. He replied yes and stood up to walk to the front. He knew that his intrinsic magic capacity was almost zero, but he wondered how things would turn out now that he was a space-time mage. He decided to try pouring some space-time magic into the mirror as a test. He placed his hand on the mirror and infused it with his space-time magic. After that, he opened his eyes, and the teacher was stunned in confusion when a bright light emanated from the mirror. Suddenly, the mirror exploded and shattered into pieces, causing the teacher to fall to the floor and leaving the students in shock. He realized that he shouldn't have done something so dramatic, because it made him stand out unnecessarily, while in the background, Shinjuku giggled. After school, as he exited the building, he heard students whispering, asking if he was the god of plagues who had destroyed the measuring device. They murmured that further inspection revealed it was a form of unknown magic, but other students couldn't believe it, knowing that if it were true, he'd be above rank A. He thought about how different this gossip was from what he used to hear and felt it was much more exhausting. Suddenly, someone called out to him, so he looked around confused. The voice then beckoned him into the bushes, and what emerged made him gasp in surprise. The fluffy stuffed toy spoke to him, and he recognized the voice, asking if it was him from the letter and what was with its form. His future self replied that it was a type of space-time magic that had possessed the plushie at his house. He questioned his future self if this explained everything, but his future self only stated that it was an emergency as the Chaos Dragon had appeared earlier than in the future he knew of. He asked his future self what he meant by Chaos Dragon, and his future self explained that the Chaos Dragon was bad news, because it had destroyed the Adventurers Guild in the Ariak area, resulting in many casualties. It also caused an unprecedented catastrophe and was a monster categorized as an alpha-type extermination target, just as in his future. His future self emphasized that since it appeared earlier than expected, they had to defeat it no matter what. He told his future self that if they didn't, the catastrophic events would repeat themselves, to which his future self agreed, confirming that it was just as it had been in his future. Shocked by the revelation, he shouted to his future self that if that was the case, they had to contact the Adventurers Guild and request an extermination team, because with a squad of high rankers, even the Chaos Dragon would be more manageable. However, his future self just looked back, stating that they couldn't because time was up. Suddenly, he heard something massive approaching from above. When he looked up, he was stunned to see the Chaos Dragon soaring overhead. He asked his future self if the dragon wasn't supposed to be confined to a dungeon, but his future self replied that it was a ferocious migrating species unlikely to stay in one place. As the dragon flew past them, he cursed in panic, knowing that if it continued on its path, the school would suffer casualties. The students, who had been peacefully exiting the school and engaging in light-hearted chatter, stopped abruptly as darkness enveloped their surroundings. They looked up in horror at the dragon flying above, frozen in shock and questioning why it was there. The dragon stared down at them and dove toward the ground, prompting them to flee back to the safety of the school in terror. A lady shouted for everyone to prepare for battle and instructed the non-mage students to evacuate hastily to the school dorms. Meanwhile, the mages took their positions. He ran after the dragon, shouting back to indicate that the students in front were the student council's mage security guards. The students formed a magic circle and aimed it at the dragon hovering above them. They began attacking the dragon with their magical powers, and the lady in front raised her staff, commanding her team not to let the dragon near the school grounds. She then cast a massive magic circle above the dragon and unleashed an attack that resulted in an explosion. Her team proudly thought they had subdued it, and she smiled as they praised her, but her smile turned to shock when she heard the dragon growling in anger. To their dismay, they realized that their attacks had no effect. It was immune to anti-dragon magic bullets. The dragon then gathered power in its mouth and released a devastating blast toward the student council's mages. The attack hit them directly, giving them no time to escape and causing massive destruction on the ground. In an instant, the student council's mage security guards were down. His future self commented that this was to be expected since they were only student mages. He shouted at his future self that now was not the time for such remarks, but his future self simply called his name. Before he could look, his future self threw something at his head. He asked his future self what he was doing, and the reply came that it was dragon incense, a scent that lures dragons. His future self explained that the dragon, being a ferocious migrating species with low intelligence, would now pursue only him. The dragon then swooped down toward him, ready to attack, But his future self sternly told him that he had to face it and show them the power of a space-time mage. The dragon glared at him in anger. His future self shouted that it was coming their way and urged him to run, which he did. Suddenly, he heard someone asking if they were okay. Turning in surprise, he saw Shinjuku helping the students. His future self asked him if he truly wished to keep Shinjuku out of this ordeal, to which he responded affirmatively. His future self then advised him that the best course of action would be to run, suggesting this would minimize the risk of witnesses to their battle. Using his quick body skill, he sped away with the dragon in hot pursuit. A moment later, he arrived at Tokyo City JR Nakano Station. His future self informed him that the train yard was currently deserted and instructed him to jump over the fence to lure the Chaos Dragon, which he promptly did. Once they were on the other side and waiting for the dragon, he asked his future self about the dragon's characteristics. His future self explained that the dragon belonged to the dark element, possessed very powerful dragon breath which meant instant death if confronted head-on, and emitted a miasma that caused the delay effect debuff. Furthermore, it had physical attack resistance, meaning it was impervious to damage from careless attacks. He asked his future self if this meant it was an absolute monster from 5 years in the future, to which his future self confirmed it was true. However, he added that the dragon was still a juvenile with low intelligence, making it susceptible to the dragon incense. He nodded in understanding, but when his future self mentioned that the incense cost 500,000 credits, he was shocked and asked if his future self truly meant 500,000. His future self affirmed the cost and mentioned withdrawing it from his bank account, which made him grab his future self in shock and demand to know how he knew his PIN number. His future self didn't respond, causing him to curse in frustration. His future self reassured him not to worry, promising that he would easily recoup such a minor sum and that defeating the dragon would bring a substantial reward. Moreover, he emphasized that money was merely the cherry on top. The real prize would be the skill cube dropped by the dragon, which would grant him a new space-time magic spell. His future self then shifted focus back to the task at hand, explaining that the Chaos Dragon had not yet reached its mature form, so its weak point, the Dragon Core, would be exposed. As his future self was about to reveal the location of the Dragon Core, the dragon appeared above them, growling menacingly. It hurled a powerful attack at them, but fortunately they both leapt aside just in time to dodge it. As it gathered power in its mouth once more, he gripped his sword while his future self shouted a warning. He sarcastically thanked his future self for the useless advice and then skillfully dodged the dragon's multiple attacks thanks to his quick body spell. When the barrage of attacks ceased, he paused and informed his future self, who was dodging behind him, that he had managed to evade them somehow. However, he was caught off guard when another attack flew directly at him and struck him, causing him to scream in pain as an explosion erupted from the impact. Peering through the fog, the dragon noticed a blue light emerging. Shocked, the dragon saw him launching toward it while proclaiming that he was from 0.5 seconds ago. His future self looked on in amazement, wondering if he had just invented a practical application of space-time magic in the heat of the moment. He then leaped toward the dragon's core, and upon seeing it, he was certain it was the target. He swung his sword with all his might at the dragon's core but felt no connection with his strike, leaving him puzzled. Suddenly, the core unleashed power, and the dragon began to vanish before his eyes. He landed, remarking to his future self that he had not been warned about this ability, prompting his future self to recall and explain that the Chaos Dragon could transform its entire body into miasma, advising him to be cautious during attacks. He sighed and told his future self that next time he should share such crucial information before a fight. His future self warned that the dragon could also materialize the miasma to create an army of small dragon-like figures known as a legion. True to his future self's warning, the Chaos Dragon released these small figures around him, making him question if it was really just juvenile. He then guessed that it couldn't be dealt with by ordinary means. His future self told him that originally this tough enemy wasn't supposed to appear for another 5 years. He asked his future self why such a monster was appearing now, and the reply came that it might be due to him altering the future, so he should take responsibility and defeat the dragon properly. He sighed in frustration and asked if his future self meant that everything was his fault. Suddenly, one of the small dragons tried to pin him down, but fortunately he used his quick body spell in time and jumped away. Another small dragon lunged at him, and he slashed it in half with his sword. He then saw that it disappeared, which made him feel relieved because he proved that these small dragons don't transform into miasma when he hits them. His future self told him to scatter the small fry and wait for his chance to attack, but he shouted back that he would do just that even without being told. He then powered up his foot and aimed at his target. He jumped up with speed, slashing every little dragon flying in midair, trying to kill them quickly to conserve energy. A moment later, his future self noticed that he had defeated all the small dragons and that his level had increased by 3, but he was exhausted and catching his breath. He asked his future self if the Chaos Dragon had run out of small dragons. Suddenly, the dragon reappeared in front of him and spat out another attack. He was stunned and jumped away just as the attack was about to hit him, then watched it explode, destroying the ground. He narrowly avoided being caught in the blasts. The dragon gathered power in its mouth again, and he was shocked to see it attacking once more. He quickly ran from his position to avoid the next attack, noting how the hall melted from the dragon's power. He realized he had struggled with the small fry and had used too much stamina, now reaching his limits. He knew he'd have to wait a few more minutes before he could go all out and must somehow strike at its weakness, the dragon core. He sprinted toward the dragon but stopped abruptly when he saw it fly higher. His future self, smiling, told him that his attacks wouldn't reach it all the way up there. The dragon growled in frustration. Cursing under his breath, he wondered what to do next. Glancing around, he searched for anything that might help. His eyes landed on unused containers and trains, sparking an idea. He thought that if he executed his plan, he might get closer to the dragon. His future self asked what he was planning to do, noting that the situation was growing more dire by the second. Ignoring the caution, he grabbed the plushie and dragged it along as he ran. He then leaped onto the containers and up to a pole. His future self yelled that even from such a height, he still wouldn't be able to reach the dragon, to which he responded that he knew. He swung the plushie backward to gain momentum, then hurled it hard toward the dragon, shocking his future self. Next, he cast his stop chain spell on the plushie. After that, he leapt toward the plushie and then onto the dragon, causing his future self to shout in shock and disbelief. He yelled at the dragon that he wouldn't let it transform into miasma again, and used his stop chain spell to grab the dragon. He knew that such an enemy couldn't be restrained for more than a few seconds, but that was all the time he needed. He thrust his sword toward the dragon's core, struggling because it was extremely hard. He noticed his chain was fading, so he pushed his sword with all his might into the core. As the stop chain shattered, freeing the dragon, he channeled all his magic power into the sword, shattering the dragon's core. It screamed in pain, and fortunately the core cracked and then exploded, while the plushie fell face first to the ground. A minute later, he emerged from the smoke with a broken sword, but triumphantly. He had managed to defeat the Chaos Dragon on his own. The dead dragon slowly disappeared, and the system displayed that his level had increased by 15, his swordsman skill by 28, and he had obtained 872,300 credits. He also obtained a material Chaos Dragon Fang. The system then advised him to check the upgrading options for Adventurer Rank C and recommended visiting the nearest adventure guild. His future self told him that he had done as well as expected. However, he used him as a stepping stone to gain some footing. Angrily, his future self asked for the meaning of this, but he just ignored him while looking at the system. The system then showed that his secret skill, Space-Time Magic, had increased by 20 levels and his Material Rewind and Quick Body skills had increased by 2 levels each. His Space-Time Mage's passive skill had also increased by 2 levels, and he obtained 50% potential unleashing. His future self told him that they had managed to avert a catastrophic event from repeating in the future, so he guessed it was fine, and they had achieved what they wanted. Suddenly, his future self heard something approaching and warned him that it seemed like someone had reported the incident, which could be bad for them if discovered. His future self then jumped on his shoulder and told him that they were leaving now. He told his future self that it was rare for them to agree on something. He then jumped inside the fence and rushed to his apartment building. Once inside, he grabbed some food and opened it. Remembering something, he then asked his future self if he needed to eat it all, to which his future self replied that there was no way a plushie would be capable of eating and told him to try using common sense to figure things out. He retorted that if he used common sense, a plushie that could talk was way crazier. Just as he was about to eat, he remembered something he needed to do that he had almost forgotten, so he stood up and walked to a small desk. He then poured a drink into the cup and placed it in front of their family picture while telling his mother, father, and little sister Rie that he was home. His future self stared at him in silence, and he told him not to poke fun at him for doing it. His future self replied that he wouldn't because after all, he was him. His future self then decided to leave out the thing about Ria for now and continue keeping it a secret, because it was still too soon for him to know, and swore that he'd tell him when he grows as a space-time mage. He then tells his future self that he just obtained some weapon material earlier, which is the Chaos Dragon Fang. His future self tells him that his sword is already falling apart and won't withstand another battle, so it's perfect timing. His future self also suggests taking a break from school tomorrow to go do some weapon synthesis. The next day, they arrive at the Adventurers Guild, Shinjuku Metropolitan Government Office Branch. He tells his future self that he used to think that place had nothing to offer a weak, small-time adventurer like him. His future self proudly smiles and tells him that all of it is now possible thanks to him, but he just walks into the building, telling his future self that as soon as they are done with their business there, they are going home, and he shouldn't roam anywhere on his own. Inside the reception lobby, he hears an announcement that the person with number 23 should proceed to the reception counter, indicating it was their turn. He approaches the counter, and the lady asks him the purpose of his visit today. He replies that he has finished conquering a dungeon and would like her to check his results. He then hands his card to the lady who, though she initially thinks he looks like just a plain and weak adventurer, takes his card and tells him to let her take a look at his adventurer card. The lady inserts the card into her system. When the system reads the card, a panel appears in front of him. She tells him they need to confirm his identity, so he should place his hand on the panel and they will be able to check his results afterward. He places his palm on the panel as instructed, and the lady begins to check his results. However, she is shocked to discover that he has ranked up from rank E to rank C in just one day, which seems impossible to her. Stuttering, the lady exclaims that it's so strange and asks if there is a terminal malfunction. When he notices people staring at them because of the lady's action, he realizes that it was bad, and if things continued like this, he would stand out far too much, something he absolutely detested, as he hated dealing with troublesome situations. He then used his material rewind on the system and told the lady, who was facing away from him, that the system had finished authenticating his identity. The lady checked the system again and saw that his rank was E, which confused her and prompted her to ask what was going on. He asked the lady if something was wrong, but she stuttered that nothing was amiss and that she would return his card, all the while thinking how strange the situation was. He took his card and thanked the lady. After he left, the system reverted his rank to its original status, which was rank C. His future self commended him for cleverly applying the rewind to the screen, remarking that they needed to prevent their future paths from diverging as much as possible. A few minutes later, they arrived in front of the elevator, and he asked his future self if this was their destination. His future self confirmed it was and instructed him to step into the elevator. He did so, and waited for the doors to open. When the elevator doors opened, he realized they were on the rank of floor. He told his future self that they couldn't enter unless they were rank A, but his future self simply told him to forget about it, and then transformed into a letter. He looked at the letter, puzzled by the situation, but his future self ordered him to hold it up to the scanner. He reminded his future self that they were in a high-security area, but his future self insisted he just follow the instructions. He complied and scanned the letter at the scanner. The rank A gate opened, and he walked inside while his future self told him they should begin synthesizing a weapon suitable for a space-time mage immediately, making him smile in excitement. He then asks his future self if there is a field trip planned for today, but notices a man typing on a computer nearby. His future self responds that there is no field trip. Instead, they are visiting to request the synthesis of a weapon. The man stands up, noticing them, and asks if he is an adventurer with at least a rank C qualification. This man is the Weapon Synthesis Laboratory Chief, Shiroyama Tokamune. Shiroyama, eyeing him suspiciously, remarks that he looks more like a rank F student and questions if he tricked security to get in there. His future self whispers for him to show Shiroyama that thing. He then presents the Chaos Dragon Fang to Shiroyama, explaining that it is a rare material dropped by a formidable enemy. He requests to use it as a synthesis material to enhance a weapon. Shiroyama examines the Chaos Dragon Fang closely and acknowledges its quality. Shiroyama asks if the material came from something he hunted, to which he replies affirmatively. Shiroyama then inspects his sword while nodding in agreement. Accessing something on his smartwatch, Shiroyama causes a device in the middle of the room to activate. He explains that it is the latest and most advanced synthesis device in Japan, at the cutting edge of otherworld research. He notes that the analytical results for the Chaos Dragon Fang aren't even recorded in the guild's database, so he will use this opportunity for study purposes and let him use the device for free. Shiroyama also tells him to call when he is done. He puts his bag down while his future self mentions that he has never done weapon synthesis before, so he will teach him now. A system interface pops up in front of him, indicating that they are not allowed to take the synthesis course at the academy, unless they are rank B or above. He steps inside the machine as his future self explains that synthesis is divided into 4 steps. First, he must decide which weapon to use as the base for the synthesis. For him, it will be the sword lent by the academy. Second, he should decide on the attribute he wants the weapon to be imbued with. The number of attributes a weapon can have is determined by its rank, and since his sword is a rank F weapon, it has 1 attribute slot. Third, the material he is using to do the enchanting. Types of material belong to groups such as mineral materials or monster bone materials. There are cases in which sometimes 2 swords can be combined as well, but in his case, his material will be the Chaos Dragon Fang. The last step, after deciding all of that, is finally synthesis time. How much he decides to spend on the actual forging steps is also a factor because the strength of the weapon will be determined by all of the above, which he responds that he understands. He then puts his sword into the machine to be the base of the synthesis. The system asks him to choose the elements he wishes to imbue, which are fire, water, wind, earth, and light elements. His future self tells him that there is nothing they can do about it, and he should take the light element as his first choice, which he follows. The machine on one side then opens, making him ask if he was right that he had to put in the strengthening materials. He then puts the Chaos Dragon Fang inside, and after that, it closes. He was deciding to set the forging time when his future self tells him that they should go with 3 years, making him shocked and shout that he couldn't wait that long. But his future self just tells him to do as he says, so without any choice, he follows and sets 3 years. The weapon then begins to synthesize and tells him to look forward to its completion in 3 years' time. Suddenly, his future self jumps into the machine, shocking him. It then heads to the machine's side, and the machine releases a strong surge of power, causing a loud explosion. The machine then thanks him for waiting so long and announces that the weapon synthesis is now complete. It reveals a chaos sword with the light attribute and a rank. His future self reappears in his pocket, looking worn out but affirming that the synthesis is real and completed. He can hardly believe it and asks if it's truly done, to which his future self confirms, adding that this process can't be done too often. Shiroyama is shocked, unable to believe that a 3-year-long forging was completed in just a few seconds. He begins typing on the system, baffled by what just happened. His future self urges him to hurry up and move, saying it's time for them to go. He sighs, placing the sword in his inventory, and tells his future self he thought he'd never say that. He then thanks Shirayama and tells him he'll be leaving now. Shirayama tries to stop him, but he walks away, overhearing a conversation about an anonymous rumor. Intrigued, he listens to a man telling his friend that they killed a ferocious migrating species in an instant and wonders what kind of person could do that. The friend speculates that if their identity were known, it would trigger a scouting battle between famous clans and mentions wanting to be scouted by the rank S adventurer Lumika clan. The man responds that it will probably never happen in the lifetime of a rank D like him. As he passes by, he thinks it's really bad and suggests they should leave immediately. However, his future self, now turned back into the stuffed toy, disagrees and suggests they seize the day and head for a little sword test. He asks his future self where, and it replies that they should go to the place where the sacred beast Cerberus resides. He stops in horror, asking if he just mentioned the sacred beast Cerberus. Just then, Shinonome appears in front of him, panicking and calling out his name. With teary eyes, Shinonome tells him that she is so glad he is alive. She explains that they told her the monster that attacked the school was after him. She also mentions that she has been sending him messages for the longest time, but they remain unread, and he didn't even attend school today. She then shouts at him, expressing how worried she is. This makes him stutter and ask what she was doing there. She retorts that she should be the one asking him that, and explains that she came as a representative to deliver an application for a student-led dungeon raid. He acknowledges her and recalls that she is the top second-year student in the mage program. His future self whispers to him to cut it short without giving out any unnecessary information, to which he replies that he knows. Shinonome wipes her tears and tells him again that she is really glad he is okay. He scratches his head and apologizes for making her worry. As she looks up at him after wiping her tears, she notices the stuffed toys behind him and asks about the plushie, remarking that it's so cute. She then grabs it out of his backpack, asking to take a closer look. She hugs it and says that it somehow gives off the same scent as him, which puts her at ease. He panics, thinking it's bizarre, but it gives him an idea. He then tells her she can keep it for a while if she likes it so much, shocking his future self. She replies that she can give it back later, thanking him. She looks at the stuffed toys while he walks away, telling her not to mention it, thinking he managed to divert her attention somehow. She happily waves goodbye as his future self calls out and shouts at him not to leave him there. The next day at the Adventurer Cultivation Agency High School Division, his future self isn't talking. So, he tells it not to be mad, reminding it that he went back to get it right away. His future self angrily shouts that the issue isn't that, but rather that he was able to see the childhood friend he lost 10 years ago, once more, all thanks to him, and he expresses his gratitude. He responds that it's good for him without noticing someone filming him from above. The man recognizes him as Kujyou Haruto, the so-called god of plagues. The mysterious man then looks at him and finds him interesting, deciding to set him as his next target. He tells him to entertain him and calls him Mr. Mysterious Dragon Slayer. Meanwhile, in the student consulting office, someone slams a hand on the table in anger. The student council vice president, Sakurakuji Yuzuki, asks Haruto if he really doesn't know anything about it. He replies that he doesn't, and Yuzuki explains that the day before yesterday, when the ferocious migrating species attacked after classes, she heard that the direction he ran away was the same as where the monster was heading. He responds that the monster changed targets midway, focused its attention on another student, and went somewhere else. He also tells her he was sure it was that guy who defeated it, and it was a very close call for him. She asks if he knows the identity of the student who defeated the monster. He shakes his head and explains that at that moment he was too focused on trying to escape. She sighs and tells him she understands. He walks to the door, saying he'll be taking his leave now because class will start soon. She tells him to wait a second, but he still walks out of the room, wondering why he is being suspected. His future self replies that it's probably due to the live video showing him jumping to the dragon and killing it instantly. He asks his future self if they can stop it from being spread using space-time magic or something, but his future self replies that it's impossible with his current skill. He then sighs and walks into his classroom, surprised when he hears his classmates, but he just walks to his seat. One classmate says that things are finally going to get started. He sits on his chair, thinking that he was already being avoided in class, but today it feels different from how it normally was. Shinonome then appears in front of him, shouting that he needs to be careful and get away. Someone tells her that she doesn't need to tell Haruto anything more. The high school division's third-year student and student council president, Sumeragi Ryuga, steps in and tells Shinonome that he'll take it from there. He introduces himself as Sumeragi Ryuga, the student council president and the genius magician who reigns supreme at the top of the school hierarchy, meaning he is the school's strongest. Ryuga then asks if he is Kujyou Haruto, and he replies yes. Ryuga tells him that he came to request a magic duel. His classmates begin to whisper and tease him from behind, thinking that he is finished, but he just stares seriously back at Ryuga, who smiles at him. Ryuga tells him that a failure like him with zero magic capacity destroyed the device used for measuring the magic capacity of a mage. Traces of an unknown substance were left at the scene, and he also annihilated that ferocious chaos dragon alone. Haruto wonders how Ryuga knows about this, but Ryuga just tells him that it is very interesting, which is why they should nip it in the bud while it's still in its early stages, making Haruto glare at him in anger. Ryuga then declares that the truth will be revealed, adding that he is also someone who has defeated a dragon single-handedly. Therefore, they should decide in a magic duel who deserves the title of Dragon Slayer. Haruto knows that a magic duel is a special form of test sanctioned and facilitated by the Adventurer Cultivation Agency, conducted between students to gauge and assess their actual strengths. The outcomes of these duels determine the ranking of the students within the school. Students at the top of the ranking are granted various privileges within the school and are considered to be on the path to becoming an Adventurers Guild officer after graduation. The only rule in these duels is not to use any magic or spell that could result in death, permanent injury, or after effects. The participants of a duel are established at the call and discretion of the side with the lower rank, who also has the right to nominate a desired opponent of a higher rank. Haruto also knows that in a duel request, the person with the higher rank must always agree to it, but the person with the lower rank is allowed to refuse. In other words, he thinks that there is no way in hell he'd accept a duel with the #1 student in the school ranking. Ryuga then tells Shinonome that she should think more carefully about who she associates with if she aims to become a student council member next term. He looks at her chest and legs, suggesting they take the chance next time to make her fully aware of this in a close and personal private lesson. He adds that he'll teach her what it takes to join the student council. She awkwardly agrees and stuttering thanks Ryuga for his guidance in advance. Ryuga smiles at the frightened Shinonome, making Haruto clench his fist in anger. He stands up and calls out to Ryuga, saying he'll accept the duel challenge, surprising Shinonome. Ryuga is about to say something when Haruto adds that he has one condition. Ryuga asks what it is. Haruto replies that the loser must drop out of the academy. Ryuga smiles, turns around and replies that he gladly accepts, and now it's too late for Haruto to regret his words. During break time, Haruto is eating when his future self tells him that he had quite a sharp tongue and is becoming more and more like him. His future self warns him that Ryuga is strong. Haruto asks if he knows Ryuga, to which his future self nods and tells him that Ryuga will become the Adventurers Guild Shinjuku branch chief. Ryuga will come up with many new spells concerning the fire element and become one of the 7 sages. Haruto scoffs, saying it sounds more like a fool than a sage. His future self agrees, saying Ryuga's character and nature are sleazy personified. From that point onwards, Ryuga will use his position to exploit countless women under his command, confirming to Haruto that Ryuga is a scumbag. His future self continues explaining that Ryuga is also skillful at gathering followers. His certainty about Haruto being the so-called Dragon Slayer probably stems from information provided by students in his faction. Additionally, Ryuga's magic talent is outstanding, so his claim of being a genius mage isn't entirely baseless. His future self admits that the current him won't be able to win against Ryuga. He suggests they take a look at Haruto's stats. Haruto opens his stats, showing he is level 15, rank C, with the class of swordsman. His skills are swordsmanship level 31 and space-time magic level 34. His power is 61, agility is 159, defense is 9, magic power is 0, intelligence is B, mental strength is B, and growth potential is S. The system shows that his learned spells are quick body level 2, stop chain, and material rewind level 2. His future self tells him he has grown quite a lot. He then touches the system, causing it to change, and tells Haruto that compared to Ryuga's stats, he is nothing. Haruto is shocked and asks his future self if he can see Ryuga's stats. The system shows that Ryuga is level 78, rank A with the class mage. His skills include fire magic level 76, water magic level 52, wind magic level 56, and earth magic level 41. His power is 230, agility 475, defense 789, magic power 642, intelligence A, mental strength B, and growth potential B. His future self then tells him that there is a 10-fold difference in strength. Haruto, still processing this information, asks his future self if he can see other stats and if this is really space-time magic, while wondering if there is truly such a vast difference between them. He then hears a girl crying nearby, saying that she just couldn't do it. She tearfully asks why she suddenly became unable to use magic at all and expresses her fear of failing the regular examination for the mage's course at this rate. Her friend tells her that there is nothing wrong with how she uses her wand, her chanting, or any part of the process. The girl then asks if she has no other choice but to accept a private lesson from Ryuga at his place. Haruto is stunned and falls silent, hearing the girl reluctantly agree, hoping that everything will be over soon after taking her clothes off and closing her eyes. This reminds him of the scared Shinonome. He clenches his fist in anger and approaches the girls, asking if he can have a moment. The 2 girls are surprised and ask who he is and if he is someone from the swordsman's course. He tells them that they don't have to take those private lessons, because he'll take care of it one way or another. He then raised his palm a little closer to the lady and began to focus. He realized that, in the magic capacity measuring class, he could now understand the movements and inner workings of magic. He saw that the magic circuits inside the lady's body were experiencing a burn-in effect, and the traffic through the circuits was clogged due to her chanting spells that far exceeded her capacity. Knowing that in such cases one just needs to eliminate the disturbances in those sections and restore the flow of magic to normal, he opened his eyes and told the lady not to be alarmed. He got closer to the confused lady, released his power, and hit every circuit in her body, causing her to be momentarily bewildered while her friend shouted, calling her name in worry. Yuko's friend angrily asked him what he was doing, but he just told Yuko to try using some magic now. Yuko, stuttering, replied okay while her friend asked if she was alright. Yuko released some of her magic and was shocked to feel and see that she could use it again. She happily shouted that she could use magic again, and her friend could not believe it, noticing that the magic effect was even stronger than before. As he watched her happily playing with her magic, Yuko thanked him profusely, but he simply replied not to mention it. Yuko, with happy tears, told her friend that she wouldn't have to go through that horrible experience with Ryuga, to which her friend expressed immense relief and happiness. He then remembered Shinanoma's afraid face when she was talking with Ryuga after school. His future self was staring at him, so he asked what he had to do to get stronger because there were only 3 days left until the duel, and he wanted to close the strength gap by then. He then asked his future self to tell him which dungeon would have the most effect on his growth and that he could currently tackle. His future self smiled and said that he had already taken care of the next dungeon's map and information. Haruto asked what the clear rewards were, and his future self replied that the rewards were a colossal amount of experience points, new space-time magic spells, a chance to try out his newly synthesized weapon, and a beast to summon, making Haruto satisfied because that was exactly what he was talking about. He then entered the Azabu B rank dungeon Crystal Labyrinth, which is recommended for adventurers level 65 and above. Though satisfied with the challenge, he wondered if he really had to deal with that many enemies as swarms surrounded him. His future self asked what he thought about it and if it was worth the trouble. Taking out his Chaos Sword, he replied yes and thanked him. His future self then told him not to let even one of them get away, which he agreed to, jumping into the fray while shouting that he would defeat all the monsters roaming in that dungeon. 1 hour later, in the Crystal Labyrinth's deepest section, a man slashed at an armored monster, but his sword shattered into pieces. The lady then activated her staff, telling the man to move out of the way and attack the armored monster with her flame jet magic power. She proudly asked the monster if it liked it, but when the smoke from the fire cleared, they were both shocked to see the Dark Crystal Knight still alive, with 230 health, 50 mana, 340 attack, 610 defense, and B magic resistance. They hugged each other in horror, realizing their attacks didn't work. When the knight was about to end their life, they closed their eyes, but then something blocked the knight's attack, causing an explosion. When the man opened his eyes, he was shocked to see someone's sword piercing the knight's head and slashing it, causing it to explode into pieces. The lady, stuttering, said that they were saved, and the man thanked him. Haruto told them that enemies appeared in great numbers in that dungeon, so it was better for them to leave quickly. The man then worriedly asked what about him and what he was going to do. Haruto replied that in order for them to escape successfully, he would attract the enemy's attention. When the knights were gathered in front of him, he told them to quickly go. The man apologized for leaving and thanked him once again. After they left, his future self told him that counting the ones from just now, he had defeated 89 of them thus far, but he hadn't fulfilled even half of his quota yet. Haruto replied that he was fully aware of it. His future self then told him to finish quickly and level up as soon as possible. He then raised his sword and slashed every monster close to him, while his future self told him that this type of monster gives the most experience points inside the Crystal Labyrinth. Killing them is the most efficient way to level up. However, with his current strength, they were quite fearsome enemies. He immediately looked back and used his stop chain skill to attack every knight trying to ambush him from behind. His future self reminded him that his weapon, the Chaos Sword, had been imbued with the light element, allowing him to fight these monsters on equal footing. Landing in the middle of the group where other knights were surrounding him, his future self urged him to defeat as many as possible. He activated his quick body skill, disagreed with his future self, and shouted that he wouldn't leave even one of them standing. The knights were pushed back slightly by his power as he blocked every attack they threw at him. Seeing an opportunity, he slashed every knight in front of him. He then paused for a moment to catch his breath but was shocked when a huge knight charged at him. It was the Dark Crystal General, boasting 480 health, 125 mana, 560 attack, 880 defense, and a magic resistance. His future self explained that it was a boss-type monster. He blocked the general's sword with his own. He tried his best not to be overwhelmed by its sheer power. Deciding to use his sword's special properties before being overpowered, the sword disappeared, and he managed to jump away in time to dodge the general's attack. The sword then reappeared, allowing him to get behind the general with incredible speed. He swung it forward and cut the general's head with all his might, successfully killing it. Exhausted, his future self called out to him, and he shouted back in frustration, asking what it was as he was currently busy dodging attacks from the remaining knights. His future self responded that he probably knew this by now, but he would say it anyway. The core principles and fundamentals of space-time magic are different from regular magic. It doesn't work through magic capacity but uses a certain factor that governs the flow of time in the world, which is why even someone with zero magic capacity like him can activate it. He shouted at his future self, asking if he was really telling him this right now while he was busy blocking and attacking the knights. His future self calmly replied yes, explaining that extreme conditions during a fight are the most effective way to learn. When he was overwhelmed by the enemy, he activated his stop chain, hitting every knight in front of him. He then swiftly slashed them. He then heard someone approach from behind, and his future self warned him not to let his guard down. He saw the Dark Crystal Sorcerers, each with 120 health, 490 mana, 210 attack, 320 defense, and B magic resistance. The sorcerers gathered their magic power in their hands. When his future self saw him stunned in shock, he reminded him that he is a space-time mage. He easily dodged their attack while his future self told him that he should always be aware of the chrono factor even during battle. As the attacks closed in on him, his future self shouted for him to seize the flow of time. He did so, causing the attacks to slow down. Despite this, one attack hit and caused an explosion. When the smoke cleared, he emerged and pointed a magic circle at the sorcerers. Raising his other hand, he gathered power and then attacked the sorcerers with a strong burst of magic, wiping them out in an instant. He then looked at his hand, asking his future self if this was what using the flow of time meant. His future self replied that yes, that is how it works, and thought that Haruto might even be more talented than him, because he had released a chrono ray. A moment later, after killing a pile of knights and catching his breath, the system continuously popped up, showing him that he had leveled up. Ignoring the notifications, he asked his future self where their next target was. He then entered the Crystal Labyrinth's inner chamber at the deepest level and saw the dungeon boss, the sacred beast Cerberus, waiting for him inside. Before he entered the boss gate, he felt a strong pain inside his head. His future self explained that it was a negative side effect of using space-time magic continuously, increasing the burden on the brain. His future self then asked if he wanted to go back, but Haruto placed his hands on the gate and replied no, saying that time was running out. Even faced with the sacred beast Cerberus, his future self told him that the boss had a sense of integrity and dignity not found in many monsters. That being said, he shouldn't let his guard down. The sacred beast Cerberus growled loudly and walked closer, while his future self remarked that if phrased in an old-fashioned way, one could say it was a magic beast with the soul of a samurai. Haruto clenched his teeth as the pain in his head intensified, which his future self noticed. While the sacred beast Cerberus stared at him, his future self handed him a bottle, telling him to drink it because it would make him feel a bit better. Haruto agreed and took the bottle. The Cerberus then sat down, making him wonder if it was waiting for him to recover. Thinking it was a strange dungeon boss, he drank the potion while the Cerberus waited. His future self pointed out an old wound on its right flank, advising him to aim for it. As the Cerberus's aura of intimidation returned, Haruto wondered if it was truly waiting for him, and if he owed a debt of gratitude to a samurai. The beast then continued to approach and tried to attack with its sharp claws. Fortunately, Haruto jumped away in time to dodge it and drew his sword. He searched its body and saw the wound his future self mentioned on its chest. But suddenly, the Cerberus appeared in front of him at incredible speed, shocking him. He managed to block with his sword, and the Cerberus bit down on it. Haruto struggled to hold on as it tried to destroy his sword with its sharp teeth. He then let go of his sword and jumped above the Cerberus, but one of its other heads gathered power in its mouth. His future self shouted that it was a breath weapon, and he should dodge it. Haruto turned around in midair while it was gathering power, and when it breathed out at him, he managed to dodge it. Gathering power in his fist, he saw that the wound area was open. Seizing the opportunity, he punched it, making the beast scream in pain. He then jumped away to create distance, and his future self confusedly asked him to wait a moment. The Cerberus was shaking its three heads, and his future self asked if he had just healed its old wound with a pressure point treatment. Haruto replied that he had repaid the Cerberus for waiting for him and wanted to fight it fair and square. His future self shouted that he was crazy and warned that he could die, but Haruto insisted that respect should be returned even to a monster. Besides, he added, if he died there, it would be all he ever amounted to. The Cerberus threw something to him, and his future self was surprised to see it had returned his sword. It seriously stared at him, understanding the situation, but Haruto told it that he wouldn't be needing the sword. He closed his hands into fists and challenged the beast, declaring that this was no leveling session but a dungeon boss subjugation, a brawl. They faced each other while his future self wondered what the hell was going on between them. Suddenly, the Cerberus jumped to attack. Haruto blocked, but it swung its claw and hit him, sending him flying. Before he hit the crystal behind him, he managed to compose himself and jumped back to attack. He punched one of its heads, managing to throw it off balance, but then another head bit his arm. The beast dragged him and slammed him against the crystal. Haruto screamed in pain, and his future self worriedly called his name, shouting for him to pull himself together. The Cerberus then gathered power in its three heads simultaneously. Haruto used the flow of time, which helped him slow down the attack. He swore he would put everything he had into it. When his skill faded, the Cerberus had gathered its breath weapon and released it in his direction. Still sitting, when it came closer, Haruto managed to get away in time and appeared beneath the beast. He launched his fist with all his might, hoping his body could hold on. He continuously punched the Cerberus, giving all the remaining strength he had, but then his arm began to bleed and he felt intense pain, making him stop. He remembered it was from the bite of one of the Cerberus's heads. The beast then launched its sharp claws at him, but he channeled some of his energy into his fist and punched it, managing to hit it in the neck. The Cerberus screamed in pain. Haruto jumped toward it and launched a powerful kick, declaring that this was the end for it. He struck its center head, breaking the ground it was standing on. The Cerberus fell to the ground, defeated. Haruto lost his balance and asked if he was always such a muscle brain before collapsing to the ground. The system then showed that he had cleared the Azabu B rank dungeon Crystal Labyrinth. A moment later, he woke up and heard someone asking if he was finally awake. He looked to his side and saw his future self worriedly staring at him. He sat up and replied that it seemed he had somehow managed to beat it. The system showed that his level had increased by 20, and he was amazed at how much he had leveled up. He also saw that he had obtained the space-time maid's robe, asking what it was. His future self replied that it was formal attire and suggested they try it on later. Suddenly, something blocked the light in front of him, and he was shocked to see the sacred beast Cerberus standing closer to him. He stood up immediately as it walked towards him, but then it wagged its tails like a puppy, stunning him with confusion. He reached out and managed to touch it, patting it while his future self told him that it seemed to like him quite a bit. Haruto asked if he was right that this was supposed to be the dungeon boss. His future self admitted that he never expected things to go like this, but they got the rewards anyway, so they should just be glad about it. Haruto asked if he meant the equipment, but his future self replied no, explaining that the reward was the summoned beast, the sacred beast Cerberus, the best clear reward for the Crystal Labyrinth. However, they hadn't established an official contract yet, and if Haruto fed it his blood, it would become his vassal. Haruto bit his finger to make it bleed and put his blood into the Cerberus's mouth. The Cerberus slowly disappeared while his future self told him that he would be able to summon it whenever he wished from now on. The system then showed that the sacred beast Cerberus was now his vassal. His future self told him that with this, they had achieved what they came there to do. 3 days later, in the Adventurer Cultivation Agency High School Division, students were whispering about Haruto, asking if he was for real as he walked by with scratches, a destroyed uniform, and a bandage on his face. Shinjuku noticed him from behind and warily asked where he had been and what he had been doing since she hadn't been able to reach him at all. He simply replied that he had been doing a little special training in preparation for the duel. She asked what he meant by special training and wondered what he could have been doing to get so worn out. He confidently told her that one way or another he was ready, making her wonder if he was the same Haruto she knew while staring at him. They talked without noticing Ryuga watching them from a tree. Ryuga thought Haruto had run away long ago and smiled in disbelief that he would choose to come there and publicly show how pitiful he was. A moment later, they met in the corridor and Ryuga told him that their duel would take place today after classes. Ryuga then teasingly asked if he had resolved himself and called him Mr. Mysterious Dragon Slayer. Haruto simply replied yes, and Ryuga reminded him that he hadn't forgotten the foolish condition he proposed either. Haruto confirmed that he remembered correctly that the loser would drop out of school. Ryuga agreed but said it was not enough because it was boring, making Haruto ask what he meant. Ryuga proudly swung his cape and suggested they add 100 million credits to the bet, roughly $640,000, making Haruto stunned and shocked. The men behind Ryuga teasingly asked if he was going to back out now and told him not to ruin everyone else's fun, so he should take on the bet. Haruto's future self, who was inside his bag, realized that Ryuga was using the students to provoke Haruto and cut off his retreat, thinking Ryuga was as sly as ever. Haruto felt Shinjuku tightly grip his hand and saw her fear while looking at Ryuga, who was smiling, thinking he would take everything Haruto owned and make him his slave. Shinjuku, stuttering, tried to stop him, but Haruto just replied that he understood and was okay with the 100 million credit bet. Ryuga turned around, smiling, and told him he was looking forward to their magic duel after school. Before Ryuga left, he told Shinjuku that she had chosen to cover for the wrong person, so she should be ready for the personal lesson he said he'd give her. She clenched her hand in fear, but Haruto told her not to worry. When she looked at him, he confidently told her that he would definitely win. After school, Haruto was walking in the corridor when his future self reminded him that it was time for the duel. He replied that he knew, but then he stopped walking when he saw a group of students gathered in front of him. They told him it was a coincidence and suggested he play with them a little before his duel with Ryuga. Another group of students appeared behind him, mentioning a 1 million credit bonus for each of them if they beat him up, calling it a big, fat bounty. Haruto kept silent, making the students ask what was the matter and if he was scared. They teased him, saying that even crying and begging wouldn't convince them to let him go. But he mumbled that it was a relief, making them look at him in confusion. He then told them he was relieved to know Ryuga was still using the same old tricks he had come to expect. He said that Ryuga was such trash it was almost refreshingly cliche, but now he could beat Ryuga to a pulp with no worries, and they were first in line to get their fair share. The man in front pointed his sword at Haruto, calling him a bastard and shouting at him not to get so cocky while launching an attack. Haruto simply grabbed the man's face and slammed him onto the floor, cracking it. He then stared at the other students, saying it was a drag and they should come at him all at once. Later in the Adventure Cultivation Agency arena, Ryuga arrogantly asked what they meant by calling Haruto a dragon slayer when all Haruto did was brag arrogantly, and now he was a no-show, wasting his time. He asked the referee if he agreed that if Haruto didn't arrive in the next minute, he should take the win by default. The referee replied, of course. The other students surrounded Ryuga, saying that Haruto was too much of a fool for trying to go against him, and that Haruto had probably just gone home scared. Ryuga smiled, thinking that his lackey had probably worked Haruto over by now. On the other hand, Shinjuku was in the audience, praying for Haruto. Suddenly, a student shouted that Haruto was there. Ryuga turned around in shock and disbelief to see him walking onto the stage. Ryuga asked what he was doing there, but Haruto simply replied by asking what was so strange when they were supposed to have a duel. Ryuga couldn't believe it and thought about his lackeys, unaware that they had all collapsed in the corridor. Haruto then faced Ryuga and told him they should get started. He called the referee and told him to give the signal to start, which the referee, stuttering, agreed to. The referee introduced Sumeragi Ryuga, a Class 3S student, versus Haruto, a Class 2F student. The referee then shouted for the duel to start, making Ryuga panic. He didn't know how Haruto did it, but decided he would personally put an end to him right then and there. Ryuga shouted that he would go all out from the start and activated his flame magic power, wrapping the stage in flames. Ryuga teasingly approached Haruto and asked if he was ready for what was coming. Haruto's future self told him that Ryuga would open with the fire spell Hellfire Grab, a high-level magic spell. Ryuga gathered fire in his palm and threw it at Haruto, shouting for him to die. Knowing that Ryuga hadn't held back at all, Haruto activated his material rewind skill. He noticed that the flame bullets were causing a disturbance in the flow of time as they advanced. He could see the flame bullets' past positions in the disruption, as well as future traces showing where they would be. By keeping a close eye on them, he could dodge them when they got closer. As the fire bullets neared him, he easily dodged them. Ryuga was in shock and disbelief, shouting that it was impossible. When Haruto stepped on the floor, it released a flame that startled him. But he jumped away in time to dodge the surge of flame. Ryuga shouted in disbelief that Haruto had dodged even his double-hit trap attack. Ryuga was then shocked to see Haruto above him, casting an attack. Haruto attacked Ryuga with his Chrono Ray, hitting Ryuga and slamming him to the floor, shattering it into pieces. The audience couldn't believe what they were witnessing and asked in panic what that technique was and if Haruto had zero magic capacity. Shinjuku was just glad and shouted that it was amazing, confirming that he was not the same Haruto she knew anymore. He then stepped down onto the stage and asked Ryuga if he wasn't going to go all out from the start. Ryuga immediately stood up, enraged by the teasing question. He dashed toward him, shouting in anger not to mess with him. Calmly, he waited for Ryuga to approach. His future self observed that the fire Ryuga was releasing was the spell Flame Dragon's Ardent Fist, a direct melee attack clad in 3000 DC flames. However, the intense heat only affected what Ryuga touched. Despite this, he blocked Ryuga's fiery fist with his hand, making Ryuga smile, thinking he was an idiot for not realizing his spell ignited anything it touched, including him. But then Haruto swiftly kicked one of Ryuga's feet, unbalancing him, and slammed him down onto the stage while still holding his fist. He then aimed Ryuga's burning fist at him, causing Ryuga to panic and sweat in fear. Haruto launched his fist but deliberately missed Ryuga's face, hitting the floor instead. Raising his fist, he told Ryuga that now his flames were out. Ryuga stood up and jumped away, shouting that he was a wretched piece of trash who was going to fail anyway. Glancing at his men behind him, Ryuga asked if they knew what to do, to which they responded by releasing their power. The men channeled their magic into Ryuga, amplifying his own power. His future self thought it was a blatant violation of the rules, yet refreshingly bold. He then asked Ryuga how much power he needed from others, but Ryuga, slowly transforming, only laughed mockingly. Ryuga's feet morphed into flaming monster feet as he unleashed his ultimate secret technique. A string of bright light and fire wrapped around Ryuga, and a strong magical flame power spread across the stage. Haruto was stunned in shock, witnessing Ryuga's transformation into a demon flame incarnation. His future self told him that Ryuga was now a giant imbued with the magical power of several dozen students from the mage's course, and that he wouldn't be able to handle it with ordinary methods. He replied that he knew. Ryuga attacked with a burst of fire breath, but he jumped away just in time to avoid it. He countered with his Chrono Ray, but was surprised to see it had no effect. Ryuga then released Flame Claws and attempted to grab him, but he narrowly dodged the flaming claws. In his desperate attempt to evade, he hit the wall, realizing he had nowhere left to run. Panic set in as the flames surrounded him and Ryuga advanced closer. He activated his Flow of Time skill and noticed something strange within the flow, like a tear in time itself. He saw a gap inside Ryuga's demon form and thought that if he could rip it wider, he could destroy it. However, before he could act, Ryuga launched his huge palm to squeeze him. As Ryuga believed he had won, Haruto slashed the demon's hand, causing it to shatter into pieces. He then jumped out and shouted to his future self to let him use the plushie again. His future self, though furious, changed into the teddy bear, saying there was no way around it. Haruto grabbed the plushie and threw it, using his stop chain skill. Activating his quick body skill, he jumped at the plushie in the middle of the chains, using the force to leap high to the top of Ryuga. Once at the top, he used his Flow of Time skill again, seeing the tear in the flow of time. He raised his sword and slashed the gap in the demon's body, tearing it in half and revealing Ryuga inside, controlling it. Ryuga panicked and shouted in shock, demanding to know what was happening, exclaiming that it was absolutely impossible because as long as the chanting continued, the magic would regenerate the giant indefinitely. Ryuga, hiding behind him, asked why it wasn't regenerating and grabbed his collar, shouting that there was no such principle and magic that he knew of. In response, Haruto punched Ryuga in the stomach, causing him to pass out on the floor. He then looked at the host and asked, "What's next?" The host, stuttering, announced that the winner was Kujyou Haruto. Later, Shinjuku and her friends gathered around a table full of food. Shinjuku then shouted to everyone that they should all say it together now, and they all congratulated Haruto on his big victory in the magic duel. Surprised, he shyly thanked them. Shinjuku raised her glass and told him to do the honors. He shyly raised his glass and, stuttering, told everyone to cheer, to which the girls happily responded with cheers. They then began to clink their drinks together, and one of the girls sighed, expressing relief and happiness that Ryuga would be dropping out of school. Another girl commented that Ryuga treated the school as his personal property and that he was too much. The girls also mentioned that Ryuga tried to solve everything with money and even committed sexual harassment. One of the girls then told Shinjuku that, given a little more time, Ryuga could have had her in his clutches, to which she stutteringly replied yes. The girl with purple hair then asked Haruto what happened to the 100 million credits that were at stake in the match. He replied that he had completely forgotten about that bet, shocking everyone. They asked him why and told him it was a waste. He replied that he was never after the money, making the girls think he was so cool. Akane then called him and asked what his relationship with Shinjuku was, confusing him and causing Shinjuku to spit out her juice in shock. Shinjuku asked Akane what she was even saying all of a sudden. Akane replied that she meant Haruto picked a fight with the top-ranked student in the school for her and asked him what the meaning of that was and what their relationship was. He panicked and couldn't answer. Just as he was about to reply, the girls stared at him in excitement, but he simply said that he needed to use the bathroom. He stood up and walked out of the room, making Akane tell everyone that he got away. The girl with purple hair told everyone that she sensed Haruto had somehow changed and asked if they felt it too. The girl with black hair replied yes, saying she felt like Haruto was more put together or mature, especially since not long ago, Haruto was almost invisible and had a terrible nickname. But now everything had changed. Shinjuku then thought that ever since that day, Haruto had always been there to help and protect her, and she was sure it would always be that way. She blushed, thinking that they even shared a secret only between the two of them. Meanwhile, Haruto was in the bathroom washing his hands when he received a message on his phone. He read Shinjuku's message apologizing because her friends had gone overboard with their questions and telling him not to overthink it. He smiled upon reading it and thought that he hadn't seen things so lively in a long time. He then clenched his hand, recalling the days when he thought such happiness would never come again. Memories of his parents and little sister eating with him flooded his mind, making him realize that the future can change. Suddenly, he was surprised when his future self, still inside the plushie, called him and appeared behind him. He asked it what was going on and told it that they would be going home in a bit, so it should stay quiet until then. But his future self told him that it was an emergency and the time had finally come, which confused him. He asked what his future self was talking about. His future self replied that it was time to reveal the reason he was there, and that his younger sister, who was supposed to be dead, was alive. This confused him even more, and he explained that Ria passed away in an accident long ago. But his future self insisted that it was not in the world he was in, and that he should get ready immediately because they would go save Ria. He then remembered Ria excitedly telling him to look at her and showing him the red scarf. He told her that it looked really warm and asked if she made it herself, to which she proudly replied yes, that she made it all by herself. He responded that he got it, which made her laugh. She gave the scarf to him, telling him that it was for him. He felt confused and wondered if it would look good on him. She sadly asked if he didn't want it, even though she worked so hard to make it. He quickly reassured her that it wasn't that, and of course he wanted it. Her face lit up with a smile, and she excitedly put the scarf around his neck, telling him he should have just kept quiet and taken it. As he looked at the scarf, Ria mentioned that the stitching was a little loose. When she finished putting it on him, she told him that tomorrow was Christmas and it was a present from Rianta Claus. He replied that he understood and thanked her for it. She then sat next to him, saying they should have a one-day late Christmas party when she got home from her ballet recital, and that it was a promise. She also told him she would give him another present then too. Unfortunately, he was unable to fulfill that promise. The next morning, the plane with Ria and his parents on board crashed, and they never returned home. He snapped back to reality when he heard his future self calling his name, asking if he was listening. He stayed silent for a moment, looking at the cabinet in front of him where the picture of their family stood next to the red scarf Ria had given him. He then apologized to his future self for zoning out and asked him to repeat what he had said. His future self told him that he had to pull himself together because he was about to tackle a quest he absolutely couldn't fail. He replied yes and asked his future self why Ria, his little sister, was alive in the first place when all the passengers died in that plane crash. There was no way Ria could be alive. His future self asked him what he had heard about the crash. Confused, he replied that he only heard it was due to a mysterious mid-air breakup that occurred at high altitude. His future self explained that it must have looked like that to them, as the mystery was beyond their current science. This puzzled him, and he asked his future self what he meant. His future self replied that on that day, a space-time hole happened to open in the sky. It was a hole that connected their world to another dimension. Even in the future, it's impossible to predict where one will appear. That hole started warping gravity when it appeared, and unfortunately, the plane his family was on flew close to it. The plane became impossible to control due to the gravitational field caused by the hole and crashed shortly after. He couldn't believe it and told his future self that even so, it didn't change the fact that all passengers died in the crash. His future self replied that while no one survived the crash, his sister's body was never found. In other words, his sister was sucked into the space-time hole alone, which stunned him. His future self then explained that the place the hole leads to is called the dimensional gap. Neither the flow of time, nor the very definition of space there are the same as in their world. Even if many years have passed in their world for Rhea, it would be less than the blink of an eye. When the space-time hole opens again, his sister will return to their world. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, yet his future self explained that this was why he had come to train and guide him. He told him that in the future, by the time he discovered the point where the other dimension crossed, it was already too late, so it must be him, the one in this world, to save Rhea. His future self then begged him to save Rhea, which surprised him. He stood up and replied that he understood and asked where the space-time hole would appear. His future self replied that it would appear far above Tokyo Tower, above the top floor of the Sky Castle dungeon. The next day, he was on a rooftop near Tokyo Tower. His future self commented that he never thought he'd buy up all the offensive items and recovery potions they had at the adventurer's shop. He replied that it was all thanks to the ridiculous amount of money he earned from leveling up in Azabu's Crystal Labyrinth. His future self noted that he was wearing a scarf in the middle of June, to which he replied that he was sensitive to the cold. His future self decided not to push the matter. His future self then explained that the gate to the Sky Castle dungeon is on Tokyo Tower's observation deck. In 24 hours, the space-time hole would open in midair 300 meters above the Sky Castle dungeon's top floor and eject his sister. But if he doesn't make it in time, his sister will fall to her death. He replied that he knew while clenching his fist and pulling out the space-time mage robe from his inventory. He then wore it and swore to his future self that he would definitely save Rhea. He heads to Tokyo Tower, where the guards shouted at him to halt, telling him that a dungeon gate has appeared on the observation deck and only adventurers holding a license higher than a rank can enter. Ignoring them, he walks away, prompting his future self to ask what he plans to do now. He replies that there is no time, so they should take the shortcut. Activating his quick body skill, he leaps up the metal tower, climbing higher and higher. Clinging to the tower, his future self remarks that he's starting to learn his methods, to which he replies that he's being annoying. He jumps to the side of the observation deck and peeks inside, spotting soldiers with an adventurer named Kurogain. His future self warns him that Kurogain is a troublesome guy. He asks his future self if he knows that man, and his future self replies that Kurogain should be the chief of the Adventurer Guild's Minato branch. Around that time, Kurogain is known to be stubborn, overly serious, and earnest to a fault. His future self also explains that Kurogain will just check around outside the gate and wait to see if anything happens, but they can't wait for that, so they should hurry through the gate. He draws his sword, causing a crash sound that surprises Kurogain and the soldiers. Kurogain orders a soldier to check the noise, and when the soldier inspects the area, everything looks fine as there is no broken window. Suddenly, Haruto appears behind the soldier and strikes the nape of his neck with his palm, making the soldier collapse instantly. Using material rewind, he restores the window he broke to enter the observation deck, ensuring the soldier saw nothing amiss. Moments later, the soldier rushes back to report to Kurogain that they have a problem. Kurogain asks what it is, and the soldier explains that he encountered an intruder who was too strong to handle, shocking Kurogain. Kurogain declares that he will deal with it personally and tells his soldiers to come with him. As Kurogain and the soldiers move out, the reporting soldier stays behind. Once they are gone, the soldier removes his helmet, revealing himself to be Haruto. His future self congratulates him on the successful strategy. Haruto then walks towards the dungeon entrance, telling his future self that they should go. His future self agrees, and they both enter the dungeon. Once inside, he was shocked to see that the world was upside down. He realized that going down the stairs in the Sky Castle dungeon meant they were actually rising and understood why it was still called a dungeon despite being in the sky. His future self explained that the dungeon's theme was the occult and warned him that undead and ghostly monsters would be attacking him. He remarked that it was ironic to face an army of the dead in the middle of a clear blue sky, and that the setting didn't suit his fighting style as a swordsman. His future self reminded him that this had been accounted for, asking him to recall the element they had imbued his sword with during synthesis. He was surprised when he remembered it was the light attribute. His future self asked if he hadn't mentioned it earlier and explained that this was the main reason he had been coaching him. His future self urged him to keep going. He rushed to the door but stopped in shock when someone appeared in front of them. He swung his sword, slashing the unknown being, and continued toward the door. His future self informed him that in the future he came from, the dungeon had disappeared soon after it was discovered, so nobody had actually set foot in it. However, he had some information on it. While Haruto was busy killing monsters along the way, his future self explained that the Sky Castle consisted of a total of 100 floors, with a powerful, unavoidable boss guarding every 20th floor. Haruto realized it meant there were 5 bosses. Checking his phone for the time, he saw that he only had 20 hours left, which meant he couldn't waste time on small fries. Suddenly, he stopped in shock as he saw monsters emerging from the floor, a swarm of thousands of monsters rushing to attack him. Frustrated and pissed, he prepared for battle as the monsters surrounded him, leaving him nowhere to run. He called out Cerberus, the sacred beast. Cerberus appeared, killing the monsters near him. He told Cerberus there was no time to lose, and that they needed to run through the monsters as fast as possible. In the Sky Castle dungeon's 5th floor, monsters charged at them, but they rode Cerberus, bypassing and killing the monsters along the way. He noticed the speed of their progress, and his future self explained that, as its full name suggests, Cerberus is a sacred beast, meaning its attacks are inherently imbued with a holy attribute. He told Cerberus to keep charging through. At great speed, they reached the 6th floor, then the 7th, 8th, 9th, and so on until they arrived at the 20th floor, where the first boss resided. Cerberus stopped running, surprising him. He asked what was wrong, but then he heard a noise above them. Looking up, he saw a smoke portal appearing. He jumped off Cerberus as his future self informed him that this was the first of the bosses that appear every 20 floors, and that he must be victorious to unlock the stairs to the next level. Horses emerged from the portal, followed by a carriage they were dragging. He saw someone controlling the horses and the carriage as it flew down from above. It landed on the floor, and 3 people with dark auras stepped out of the carriage. He recognized them as the fallen noble family's son, lady, and master. They gracefully bowed to him while he noted that they were rank undead monsters. He decided not to worry, knowing that if he couldn't defeat them, he wouldn't be able to save his sister. His future self shouted that they were coming, and he saw the 3 nobles dash toward him to attack. He told his future self to get back, prompting his future self to ask if he was going to use the item he bought at the guild shop. He replied yes, and his future self immediately jumped off his shoulder. He activated his Eye of Time, allowing him to see the flow of time and predict what was to come. He took out the orichalcum knives and threw them at the noble son. The noble son didn't even flinch and attacked with his sword, but he ducked just in time to avoid it. He then rushed toward the noble lady, attacking her with the knives he controlled. She tried to grab him, but he managed to slash her. Immediately, he looked back and threw one of the knives at the noble monster coming up behind him. He managed to pierce the knives into the noble master's chest as the noble master's spear headed toward him. He covered himself and got hit by it, but he managed to put his hand on the floor and stop himself from being pushed further. He was glad that he had set things up perfectly and could distance himself from them just fine. He then raised his hand in front of the 3 nobles and clenched it to detonate the knives embedded in the fallen nobles. A bright light exploded, taking the fallen nobles with them. His future self reminded him that each orichalcum blade, made of the rarest and hardest metals from any dungeon, was an ultra-luxury item worth 100,000 credits each and became explosive when an electric current passed through them. He remarked that he was tossing them around without a second thought. His future self then asked if it was cheap to win by throwing a few million credits at the problem, but he replied that it wasn't over yet because he had only destroyed their physical bodies. Now they had come back as ghosts to attack him. As he suspected, it was difficult to damage ghost-type monsters with physical attacks, but he knew it also exposed their vulnerability. He drew his sword imbued with the light attribute, jumped, and launched his sword at the fallen noble ghosts using his Chaos Meteor skill. He slashed them multiple times with incredible speed, making them disintegrate into ash. The system notified him that the fallen noble family had been defeated. His level increased by 5, his swordsman skill increased by 8, and he had obtained 2,283,210 credits. The stairs to the next floor opened, and he walked closer, telling Rie to wait for him because her big brother was coming to her rescue. Hours later, on the 40th floor of the Sky Castle dungeon where the second boss resided, Cerberus opened its mouth wide and bit the boss's neck, killing the undead Queen Lamia. After Cerberus defeated Lamia, it walked closer to him. When he petted it, Cerberus wagged its tails like a happy dog. He praised it for doing a great job, and his future self commented that Cerberus was more of a pet than a sacred beast. With Lamia defeated, only 3 more bosses remained. Later, on the 50th floor, his future self shouted to stop, and Cerberus halted. He asked his future self what was wrong and why they should stop there. His future self told him that there was no mistake and that he should activate the Eye of Time and take a look at the wall. Following the instruction, he was surprised to see a hidden room behind the wall. His future self jumped off his shoulder, explaining that in his own timeline, the dungeon had disappeared before anyone set foot in it, but this time it looked like it would be conquered at last. His future self then changed into the envelope and told him to insert him into a gap in the wall, just like before. He then placed the envelope in the gap in the wall, just as his future self had ordered him to. The wall split in half, and he ordered Cerberus to wait outside. Cerberus sat in response. Inside, they saw a huge crystal in the middle of the hidden room. He asked his future self if this wasn't another trick like before, but his future self assured him that he wouldn't do that now. The system showed that the crystal in front of him was called the Akashic Crystal, which could unlock hidden or untapped skills of the person who came into contact with it. He touched the Akashic Crystal, and it shattered into pieces. He then saw that he had gained space-time magic, obtained Gravity Bomb and Avatar Replay, and his quick body level increased to 3, and stop chain level to 2. Additionally, he had obtained level 3 potential unleashing with a plus 75% increase. His future self told him that he now had Avatar Replay, and he asked what it did. His future self suggested trying it in real combat. He replied that he thought he'd say that. Hours later, they arrived at the 60th floor to face the third boss, Zombie Beelzebub, known as the Lord of the Flies. He asked what its weak point was, and his future self explained that it was a flying monster that spits a melting solution, has regeneration capabilities, and stinks. He asked his future self if he was just listing its characteristics, but then he was surprised when Beelzebub appeared in front of him, launching an attack. Realizing its speed, he felt the sharp stab of its strong nose, and it thought it had killed him, but then he vanished, which shocked it. Beelzebub looked back when his future self asked if he got to use it in actual combat after all. He then rushed to attack Beelzebub from behind. He used his space-time magic, Avatar Replay, and threw the plushie away while activating Quick Body Level 3. Just as Beelzebub was about to pierce him again, he speedily ran to dodge it. He channeled his speed into his feet and ran around Beelzebub at high velocity. His future self explained that the space-time magic Avatar Replay creates a clone of his past self to temporarily take his place, confusing the enemy into thinking he was multiplying. He drew his sword and advanced towards Beelzebub. Thanks to Avatar Replay, it looked like a swarm of him was launching an attack. He activated his Chaos Meteor Sword skill and got closer, but Beelzebub spat out poison. The poison seemed to hit him, but Beelzebub was surprised when he pierced through the poison and slashed Beelzebub into pieces, killing it with multiple attacks to prevent its regeneration. Beelzebub was successfully killed, and it slowly disappeared. His future self then joked that he could call himself a ninja master now. He replied, telling his future self to stop it because it would be out of character for him. As the stairs to the next floor opened, he told his future self that only 2 bosses remained. He walked closer to the stairs to continue but suddenly felt intense pain in his head. He kneeled on the floor and collapsed, causing his future self to call his name in panic. 3 years ago, he was deep in thought while Ria begged him and acted cute. Despite her pleas, he remained silent, still pondering. She assured him that she would do her best and not quit halfway, begging him to agree. He sighed in defeat and asked if she really wanted to take ballet lessons, to which she excitedly replied yes. He agreed and told her to pick the ballet shoes she liked the most and show them to him later, making her really happy. She then began to hum as she looked through a brochure of ballet shoes, and he smiled while watching his happy little sister. The next day, at the ballet school, the students were stretching and chatting when Rie appeared. She thanked them for waiting for her and told them she was ready. The girls told Rie they were glad they could do this together, and that they should all do their best. Rie looked back and happily waved at Haruto, and he waved back. One of Rie's friends then teased her, saying she had such a brother complex and that they could feel the smell of spring in the air. They asked if it wasn't nice having her brother chaperone her around, which shocked her. She asked them what they were imagining. They then began their ballet lesson while he watched from behind. Rie followed the person in front of her, spreading her arms, lifting one of her feet, standing on her toe, and turning around happily. He smiled because she looked like she was having so much fun. After the ballet lesson, Rie waved goodbye to her friends, and they walked home together. Rie told him that ballet was really fun and difficult, but she was determined to do her best. He replied that he understood, and that it was good. Rie then looked at him and stopped, calling his name. He looked at her, confused, as she asked if the shoes and lessons were expensive. He replied that it wasn't expensive at all, and she shouldn't worry about it. She mentioned that, since their parents had gone overseas to give a presentation at an academic conference, she knew that it must have come from his own money. This surprised him, realizing she had figured it out. He told her it was really fine and she shouldn't worry about it. He asked if she was having fun earlier, and when she nodded, he said he was glad she found something she liked doing because that was always what he had wanted for her. Touched, she held her lunchbox and warmly thanked him, which made him happier. She then grabbed his arm and told him she loved him. He told her that pulling him like that was dangerous, but she replied that it wasn't, and that they would always be like this. She also told him that she had decided to put all her effort into cooking a meal to show him how much she loved him. He woke up and found himself lying on Cerberus. His future self, worried, told him that he was finally awake. He asked if he had passed out, and his future self replied yes, explaining that he had used too much stamina. He mentioned that if he used the highest grade potion he bought at the guild shop, he would be fine, but his future self said he had already taken care of it. While his physical wounds were healed, it wouldn't reverse his mental fatigue. Panicking, he asked about the time limit. His future self informed him that there were only 5 hours left. He stood up, determined, and said they should go, promising Ria that they would attend her ballet lessons together again. His future self just stared at him as he walked toward the stairs to the next floor. His future self knew that only one of the 5 intermediate bosses remained, and after defeating it, the final dungeon boss would be next. However, at this rate, Haruto probably wouldn't be able to last much longer. He realized he had no choice but to use his last resort. A moment later, they arrived at the 80th floor and faced the 4th boss, Acid King Mummy. Using his space-time magic, Gravity Beam, he easily defeated the Acid King Mummy, causing it to slam down to the floor. As a result, he gained 2 level increases, his swordsman's skill increased by 4, and he obtained 3,561,110 credits. Exhausted, he caught his breath, and Cerberus appeared behind him to cheer him up, prompting him to thank it. The system then asked if he wanted to use an elixir, to which he replied yes. His health was restored, but he still felt pain in his head due to fatigue. His future self asked if he wanted to rest, but he replied no, knowing there was not much time left, only 3 hours before his sister would come out of the space-time hole. He moved closer to the next floor stairs, telling them they should head to the top floor. Eventually, they reached the Sky Castle Dungeon's 100th floor. He told his future self that they had reached space at last, and his future self informed him it was time to face the dungeon boss. His future self explained that after defeating the boss, he would arrive at the precise spot where the space-time hole would appear. He clenched his hand and told his future self that they should go. He entered the room of the last boss and saw the god of the underworld, Soul Reaper, sitting on its chair. The Soul Reaper stared at them with its red eyes, and his future self noted that the monster before them didn't exist in the database of the world he came from. The Soul Reaper stood up, remarking that he was human and just a single one, surprising him as he realized it was a highly intelligent life form, capable of understanding language. The Soul Reaper praised him, saying that for someone of the lowly human race, whose members can't do better than to flock together and gang up on enemies, to have come this far by himself was commendable, if only just for that. The Soul Reaper then grabbed its scythe, and he drew his sword as well. They faced each other. The Soul Reaper introduced itself as the god of the underworld and told him they should begin, promising to bestow upon him the deadliest curse there was. His future self jumped off his shoulder and informed him that the Soul Reaper's weapon was actually in the database. It was called the Cursed Commanding Divine Scythe, a casting staff for high-level illusion magic imbued with permanent psychic status abnormality debuff effects. It was an extremely dangerous weapon, but he replied that he didn't care and would beat it right away. Activating his flow of time, he saw the Soul Reaper's weakness. He then activated Quick Body Level 3 and jumped toward the Soul Reaper to attack, surprising it with his speed. The Soul Reaper lifted its scythe and swung it at him, but he dodged and jumped in the air to avoid the attack. As it swung the scythe around again, he pulled out a knife and aimed at the Soul Reaper's weakness, throwing it, but the Soul Reaper blocked it with the scythe. It then jumped and appeared in front of him at incredible speed, swinging its scythe. It hit him, but it was just a copy, which the Soul Reaper realized too late. He appeared behind it and used his stop chain skill. The chains grabbed the Soul Reaper, and as he got closer to attack the trapped enemy, the Soul Reaper warned that a curse of that type wouldn't work on a god. He watched in shock as the chains dissolved easily. Freed, the Soul Reaper swung its scythe at him with incredible speed, the blade nearing his neck. His future self called his name in panic and worry. Fortunately, he leaned his head and body down just in time to dodge it. He placed his hand on the floor to regain balance and jumped away to create distance between them. The Soul Reaper remarked that he seemed confident in his speed, having dodged the godly scythe twice. However, it taunted him, saying he was still an inferior life form without wings, bound to crawl on the ground. The Soul Reaper told him that it would hinder his legs first, and then used its cursed dimension, making him feel a strong aura as the floor beneath him flipped upside down. Seeing the Soul Reaper now upside down, he shouted, asking if he was upside down again. It just smiled teasingly, and then the ground began to collapse. He started to fall, realizing the severity of the situation. It had taken significant effort to reach the 100th floor, and now he was descending. The Soul Reaper swung its cursed scythe at him, telling him he wouldn't be able to move around restlessly like it. Panicking, he quickly pulled out a knife and threw it, thinking that sometimes one must break some eggs to make an omelet. He commanded the knife to explode, and the impact caused the scythe to miss him, though the explosion force slammed him against a wall. Realizing there was a wall, he stabbed his sword into it and held on tightly to avoid falling further. The Soul Reaper was amazed but continued to taunt him. He deduced that the entire phenomenon of falling was likely the illusion magic the Soul Reaper specialized in, and that he might have fallen under its spell when he stared into the Soul Reaper's eyes. He wondered how to undo the spell. Once again, he looked at the Soul Reaper and was surprised to see it close to him. It opened its mouth and spat out an attack. He jumped away in time, but one of his legs was hit, and the curse spread quickly. The Soul Reaper told him that he would be the latest subject for its magic testing, and the grudge of dead humans would eat away at his body. It taunted further, wondering whether his own kind's hatred or the underworld scythe would kill him first. He saw the smoke reaching his body and knew he had to escape the dimensional space quickly. Desperately, he searched for a way to do just that. The Soul Reaper raised its scythe and teasingly said its farewell to him. It swung its scythe, and he clenched his teeth in panic, wondering if this was supposed to be the end for him in a place like this. At that moment, he heard Rhea calling him, and he closed his eyes as the Soul Reaper's scythe descended. Suddenly, someone used Stop Chain Level 78 to halt the Soul Reaper, surprising him. He looked at his future self and called out in astonishment, but his future self told him that this was his last resort. The plushie released a strong light, as if it was going to explode. He saw his future self slowly changing, but the bright light was too intense, so he covered his eyes. He then heard an explosion, and was stunned when he saw someone appear out of nowhere where his future self had been. His future self in his true form told him that it would be troublesome to have him die there. His future self uttered, "All things rewind," and Haruto noticed the time was flowing backward. Everything redid. Haruto began going upward. His sword came out, and the floor started to reassemble. Soon he was again face to face with Soul Reaper. Both were confused, gasping at the situation in their minds. Soul Reaper was in disbelief because his magic was dispelled by a mere human. It had been a while since his future self looked like this. Soul Reaper arrogantly stated that nothing would be changed just by increasing their number to a mere 2 lowly creatures. He then activated his power, and purple energy burst from him like Goku. He summoned hundreds of monsters, calling them his research subjects. God of the underworld wanted to pass divine judgment on the humans he uttered. His future self was amazed at the sheer number of ++ monsters summoned by the Reaper. His future self asked Haruto to stand up and go for Soul Reaper while he dealt with the small fries. Haruto was sweating in exhaustion. This monster was a god-rank monster and overwhelmingly strong, but his future self assured him that with his precision of space-time magic, Haruto would surely win. After all, he was like his future self. He stood up and confidently gazed toward their enemy. His future self put his hands on Haruto's shoulders and devised a plan in his ear that they could not hear. Soul Reaper ordered his minions to tear them apart, and his minions advanced toward them with scythes in their hands. Suddenly, a blue light lit up, and Haruto, with his future self, began running toward their enemy. Haruto ran past the minions while his future self prepared to attack. He used his gravity territory, and half of the monsters were hit by the blue beam of light. The small blue spheres flew in the air, advancing toward the minions. Suddenly, an explosion occurred, and most of the small monsters died. A few of them were chasing Haruto, but they were instantly dealt with by his future self. He activated the speed-up field skill, and a magic circle formed beneath Haruto's feet. He jumped towards Soul Reaper, who was irritated, calling him an inferior being. Soul Reaper again used the same illusion skill, but this time Haruto was fully aware of it. He broke through the curse and charged directly at Soul Reaper. He knew that attacking it roundabout would be a waste of time, so he decided to take the shortest route. While their swords clashed, he concluded that its weakest point was its heart. Their swords clashed multiple times, and then he used his Chaos Meteor skill, which hit one side of the Reaper. Soul Reaper used his Curse Edge skill and swung its scythe towards him. Haruto was hit in the chest, and blood gushed out of his body. He then used his Avatar Replay skill, which divided his taken damage with his clone. Knowing he could do it again, he decided to charge again. With a loud shout, he thrust his sword into the chest of Soul Reaper. Soul Reaper screamed in agony but then smirked. Haruto's eyes widened because a moment ago there was a heart, but now it was nowhere to be found. Soul Reaper slashed at him, and blood splattered everywhere, making his future self worry. Haruto's body was cut in half while Reaper asked if he thought that his heart was a weak point. The god of the underworld had a special skill called counterfeiting weak points, a trick to deceive humans. Haruto's body fell to the ground while Reaper laughed maniacally. Reaper ordered future Haruto to come forward, who was shocked and asked for his weak point then. Reaper replied that an underworld god like him did not have any weak point, but if forced to have one, then it would be his crown. Reaper shouted at him to die, while his future self asked Haruto if he heard that. Haruto was already behind the Reaper with his sword blade pointing at his head. He revealed that the one he cut in half was his replica. When Reaper attacked him in the torso, he split himself in two using the Avatar Replay skill. The one who charged at him was his clone while he lay on the ground. Soul Reaper shouted that even so, he had died after taking a hit by the mighty scythe. Haruto admitted that it was a fatal wound, but the space-time rollback skill was cast on him beforehand. His future self explained that it was a complicated skill with a one-time use on the same target. However, it had just worked fine. He then used the Stop Chain skill, level 78, and bound the Reaper with chains. "Let's begin the final act," he uttered. He claimed that the crown above his head was his weak point, so why not perish it along with his skull? Memories of his sister came to him. He used Big Brother Power Ultra Pro Max and beheaded the skull of Soul Reaper. Then he leaped into the air and cut it into several pieces using multiple slashes. Reaper's body and his minions began to disintegrate into the air. The system reported that he had defeated the underworld god Soul Reaper and gained 124,356 experience points. He obtained 35,635,343 credit points. Stairs to the top floor appeared. Haruto looked at his future self and asked if he was going to look like him when he grew older. He added that it would have been nice if he helped him like this from the start, but his future self told him that it was the last resort. His future self told him to stop the chit-chat because there was not much time left for the space-time hole to open. They arrived at the top floor of the Sky Castle dungeon where they saw nothing but clouds. Then a blue crack appeared in the sky. His sister could be seen in the space, and he shouted her name. His future self told him not to rush things because there were 9 minutes and 48 seconds until the space hole closed. His future self flew towards the sky while he shouted at him. Haruto had forgotten to activate his sped-up skill, but he did, and Haruto began to follow him. They reached near the space crack and he called out his sister's name. She opened her eyes and saw her brother's worried face. He assured her that he was right there and extended his hand forward. But his future self stopped him, saying that inside the space, the principles of casualty were different from this world, and only space-time magic worked to deal with it. His future self told him that he was going to push her out and made sure Haruto would catch her. His future self got behind his sister and used his skill to push her outside the space hole. He shouted towards him while his sister looked at him. Suddenly, the crack began to shrink, and he shouted about what was happening. His future self proclaimed that it was too soon for the closing. When the hole was about to close completely, his future self used his skills to hold it. He asked Haruto to pull his sister, while he prevented the hole from closing. Haruto used his skill and grabbed his sister. His future self shouted at him to be careful. If she was caught in the way of the closing, she would be torn to pieces, and if he messed up, his sister would die from the fall. He knew this, and extended his hand towards his sister. She hugged him, calling him Big Brother. He shouted at his future self to come out now. He asked what was the matter, but his future self smiled and said that this was the point where they had to part ways. He revealed that he had reached his limit and used all the chronos in his body, so he could no longer keep this form. He said that he had no power to come back. His future self expressed that he was not a good disciple, because he complained a lot and messed up things. Haruto was the type of guy who, when he looked like he was improving, got pulled by his emotions and kept making blunders. He claimed that he had no regrets about fighting alongside a kind-hearted person. He revealed that this space-time hole was never going to appear again. Haruto shouted at him to wait, but his future self entrusted him with his hopes. He asked him to save this world, which Haruto happily agreed to. He said that this was a promise while Ria looked at him. His future self was relieved that this young lady was fine. Ria looked at him and asked if he was also her brother. This flooded his future self with memories of his sister. He welcomed her home, then the space hole vanished from the sky. Haruto began screaming and tears rolled down his cheeks. He had regained and lost someone important to him at the same time. One day after clearing the Sky Castle dungeon at the Adventurer Cultivation Agency, Haruto entered the classroom and was met by a group of ladies who claimed to be waiting for him. He was confused upon seeing third-year seniors. A girl told him that, as the delegation of the Ryuga Victims Association, they would like to show him their deepest gratitude. Then, they all thanked him simultaneously. One of the girls said that they were relieved that a scumbag had been beaten to a pulp, while others claimed that there was no more need to cry themselves to sleep. She pointed at Haruto, shouting that he was their savior, even giving him the name God of Plagues. He told them to stop and thought that he just wanted a quiet, peaceful life. Then, Student Council Vice President Sakura Yuzuki stepped forward. She bowed her head and asked for forgiveness for the incident caused by President Ryuga. He told her not to worry because it was not her fault. But she insisted, saying she was the next Student Council president. She lifted her head and asked if he wanted to help the school from within. Adjusting her glasses, she revealed that she was recruiting students for the Student Council and requested Haruto to join. He humbly rejected her offer, making her pale. She grabbed his hand and insisted he join. Shannon arrived at the class and was stunned to see the vice president approaching Haruto. Her classmate dragged her away, saying that class was about to begin. While leaving, she told Haruto that they would continue this at break time and ordered him to stay in the class. Later, he was sitting on the rooftop bench, checking his system. His system displayed that his level was 98 with rank C and recommended he upgrade to rank A. His swordsmanship was at level 64, and his space-time magic was at level 82. Acquired spells were Quick Body level 3, Stop Chain level 2, Material Rewind, Gravity Beam, and Avatar Replay. With these stats, he felt like he would not be able to lose to anyone now. This might be because of defeating too many enemies. He was surprised to see his credit amount, which was 43,454,435, a sum no mere high schooler should have. He heard a noise, and suddenly the council president burst open the door, shouting where he was. But he was nowhere to be found. While watching them, she expressed that she had told him not to leave the class and decided to check the gym next. Haruto just calmly finished his burger. He would have to come up with a plan, because if things went on like this, he would be in trouble. He looked back for advice and saw a plushie there, but it was just his imagination. Sometime later, he reached his home and opened the door. His sister shouted that he was late and she had been waiting for him. She then smiled and welcomed her big brother home. She brought food to the table, saying that it was a homemade meal made by her. She noticed a bag in his hand and asked if he had bought it from a convenience store. He sweated because he had bought it out of habit. Ria told him not to buy unnecessary things. She said that they were going to live together from now on, so they had to economize. He agreed and smiled at her. She called his name and, with a cute face, welcomed him home. He recalled the same words from his future self. He smiled, saying that being home was good. She asked him to do something before dinner. They stood in front of their family picture and thanked their parents for raising them. She noticed the scarf she had made for her brother. She asked if he held it all the time, to which he answered in the affirmative. She smilingly said that it was June. He replied that he got cold easily. They sat down for the meal, and he thanked her for the dinner. He ate a portion, and his sister asked about its taste, to which he said it was delicious. She said that he was actually back, and he replied that he had submitted the necessary documents to the government office and assured them that his sister was alive. She had lost 2 years, so she wanted to catch up on her studies, and Haruto reminded her of the dance class. She asked if that would be okay financially. He assured her not to worry. He jokingly said that she did not have to worry because she could continue her dance classes even after she became a granny. She laughed, saying that this was not what she meant. She also thanked his future self while looking at the plushie. Haruto agreed that they had to be grateful to him. He recalled his last words of saving the world, but he was confused about how he was going to do it. Ria reminisced about something and showed him a blue cube, saying that it had been in her clothes when he rescued her. This is a magic cube, he uttered, and the cube began to glow. Plushie's hologram came out of the cube, which surprised Haruto. Plushie stated that if he was listening to this message, it meant he was no longer in this world. He said that Haruto was at a loss, wondering how to save the world. He revealed that he had already prepared for a situation like this. Plushie said that he was awesome and felt free to praise him. Haruto was irritated, and Plushie revealed that he had transferred a letter from Future Version 2 to his inventory. He told him to rely on it to save the future. That's all for today. If you wish to have another part of this recap, comment below, and please don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more content like this. Until next time.